So the Friendship Salon was a really beautiful story. I think one of the things we have to be careful of as photographers is portraying people as victims and portraying people as needing help and sort of portrayed in a weakness. And I think that often comes across in pictures you see of people in refugee camps, people in conflict areas. The Friendship Salon was a really positive story about a group of women from South Sudan who were living in a refugee camp in Uganda. And they were mainly women who had lost their husbands or been separated from their families. And in South Sudan, family networks are incredibly strong. So if you're a mother, you have a network of people that help and support you. And these women found themselves on their own and very isolated. There were attacks on single women, sexual violence against single women. They were very vulnerable. But they came together and they created a hair salon in this camp. And it was really, the hair was one part of it. It made sure that they had some income, which was great. But it was more about the unity that came together from these women. And they called it the Friendship Salon. And they would go there every day and they'd work together and they would do these amazing hairstyles. I learned a lot about all the different styles. There was the doo-doo, there was the macron, all these different styles that they did. But as I say, what it was is they had built their own community. And that's something that I think is very important to reflect in storytelling. And for me, with my NGO, Legacy of War Foundation, it's also how we work with communities. We are beneficiary-led. So we will go to a community like that and say, how can we support you to do what you're doing? How can we increase? And, I've seen this a lot actually in Ukraine. At the beginning of the war, there were a lot of stories about what was happening with people with disabilities who were often left behind. And now people with disabilities in conflict zones are often marginalized, often don't get the support they need. But what I didn't like is people were constantly being portrayed as victims. So whenever it was somebody with a disability, they would be in a wheelchair, stuck in the mud, and we're supposed to kind of immediately feel sympathy. I went there and did a story on some amazing people like my friend Liana, who is the world wheelchair karate champion. And she had led a whole convoy out of Bucha in her adapted car, about 100 cars through Russian lines. And many other people like that, these really strong, incredibly powerful, mainly women who had disabilities, but they were leaders of their community. And I was like, why do we see this portrayed in storytelling? Why is it people with disabilities always had to be shown as victims? And that's very true as well of women's stories. Women are often portrayed in conflict zones as victims. So the Friendship Salon was about readdressing that and say, here's some women that, yes, they are going through incredibly difficult times. They are vulnerable in the situation they're living in, but they have created a business, they've created their own community, and then we can support them to grow and continue doing that. A lot of people talk about empowering communities. You can't empower someone else. How could you come along to those women and empower them? No, but what you can do is break down the barriers that are stopping them empowering themselves and growing into a greater business and a greater community. So, for me, it's important that we don't portray people as victims, that we show the strength. Because, as I say, there's this sort of idea, and I have to say, it often comes through men in the West. Photography, most, history of that photography comes from that view, and it portrays people, and especially people in Africa, as victims. And in some small way, I'm hoping to readdress that.